talked about the story of the Olympics.
Whatever comes naturally to you, Pat, and then we'll fit it all in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Ready?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, Andrew. Thank you. You were telling me about the importance of waterways, the big picture and the focus. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, and part of my role is helping people interpreting waterways into other people's terms, so you can help people understand where waterways can actually deliver their objectives. And obviously from my own point of view and our own organisation's point of view, there are mutual benefits in that as well. We want people to see waterways as being relevant to them, so that waterways play a part in their lives, so waterways are important to them. Because in the UK, it's only 60 years since waterways were being abandoned and filled in, and we never want to go back to that. And one of the ways of ensuring we don't go back to that is make sure that waterways are part of people's lives, and they want to protect them and look after them. So in terms of in rural areas, then the tourism and the visitors to waterways provide a support for facilities that are actually very important to local people. So it may be a shop, post office, local pub. So for example... And
you had a good example, didn't you, with the pub in Wales?
Coach and Horses at Cwmcrannon on the Monmouthshire and Brecon Canal. It's not within a village, and it gets 60% of its trade from the canal, people using the canal. And 96% of the users of the canal are land-based visitors. They're walkers, they're cyclists, they're anglers, they're people who use the land rather than the water. Although the image of a canal is very strongly about, or in the UK, it's very strongly about a man on the back of a narrowboat, usually with a wife working the locks. It seems to be the way it works. And if you're talking to potential funders or developers or other people, they're not interested in boats and boating, but they are interested in the other things that water can bring, which is life, activity, vibrancy, and support to facilities that local people need. The other element of it is people then can be proud of their place, so it's giving people pride of place, so they like the place they live in. That also helps the tourism business because they're proud of it, and then we'll talk to the visitors and say why they're proud of their place. And also a link with the past, so their cultural history is linked into the canal and the role the canal played in the development of their community. So that gives them a common theme. If you've got a lot of incomers coming to an area, or you've got an ethnic mix, then again there's a common understanding that can bring people together. And then if you actually got a level of commitment and interest in the local community, so they then start volunteering and working on the canal or around the canal. At Llangaffuc we've got a very active village community, and they've taken over a piece of woodland. They're removing a non-native species, they're putting in bat boxes and bird hides, they're also using the trees for coppicing for biofuels. So it's now part of the community and part of a much bigger picture. But there you've got people from all sorts of backgrounds working together, mixing together, and then you build understanding and familiarity with the people. So there are all sorts of, to use the jargon phrase, social cohesion and capacity building and all that sort of stuff can be done around waterways as well. Then if you're looking at a bigger area or a wider area, it's making sure that the waterway is not seen as an edge or a barrier, but actually taking a helicopter view, looking down onto the wider area and the part that the landscape plays, and the waterway as being an integral part of that landscape. So one example is the Olympic site, where the waterways within the Olympics, and there are waterways crisscrossing the Olympic site, going across it and through it and up and down it, and using those waterways within the site itself. And originally when the site was planned, there were land uses that were in individual parcels of land, one this side of the waterway, one that side of the waterway, and the waterway was a dead space between the two. And what we were able to persuade them to do was to take a helicopter, look down, and then look at zones that crossed the waterways. And the waterways then became a route through the zones. They became there was common features across the waterways as well, so that if you're standing on one side of the waterway, the other side makes sense. So again, using a jargon phrase, the landscape was legible, you could actually understand it. And the way people moved through the landscape was using those sources. That also enabled you to look at how the landscape actually worked. In the north of the Olympic site, it's very rural, very soft. The south of the Olympic site is very urban, very hard. So you're able to have a gradation then between the hard urban areas and the soft rural areas, and look at the landscaping and the way the waterways and the land worked to adopt that and make sense of the landscape as you walk through it. The river itself was a tidal river, so you ended up with mud flats, which isn't particularly attractive in an Olympic site. So we persuaded, or the case was made for putting in a tidal barrage to maintain water levels. There were then discussions about how you then maintain that water, if it's not muddy but it is shallow. And also, with the Olympic side in particular, there are issues about security and how the police couldn't move around, or the army now, and therefore you needed navigable depth. When you start talking about navigable depth, you then say, well, okay, you can then use the waterway to bring construction materials in and take it out. That then takes traffic off the congested roads of London, and the cost of putting in a new lock and maintaining a deeper water in that river was a third of the cost of improving the roads to take the amount of traffic. So a new lock was built, so freight traffic could come in.
That was Prescott Lock?
It was, yeah, not 3 Mills Lock, it's now called. Prescott Lock didn't go down too well with the current government. Although Prescott Lock is a historic name, people thought it was named after John Prescott, which it wasn't. So it's now got 3 Mills Lock. But that meant construction traffic could use the river, and also during the legacy as well. Again, you can use construction traffic, but also you could take waste out through that way as well. And of course, it's a great leisure resource. So the waterway can now be navigated all times of day or night. And that then transformed the site then, because then you had water. But because it was a river, it was below ground level. So we then terraced the ground, or I say we, the architects, terraced the ground. And there was some debate about disabled access and whether it should be slopes or steps. Steps actually work very well, because you can sit on the steps and you can make use of the ground. You can have events on the water and use that as a grandstand. But they were around obviously to make sure that it was still fully accessible. So that debate happened as well. The other area in terms of water is, particularly in bays and harbours and areas where there's a wider water, it's making sure the water is part of the landscape. So you're on the land, the water still makes sense to you. And ways of doing that are to draw the eye out on the water, either through activity, through moorings, through art, so that as you're on the land, you're not on a constrained harbour, you're actually on a much bigger landscape, and you can actually look out towards the horizon and see how the water and the land work together. The land uses are important, so the land uses and the water uses need to be considered together. So if you're having a harbour and moorings, it may be that you don't want to have people living on the ground floor against the boats. But having mixed uses and active uses could be very important. And then you've got life and activity 24 hours a day. People living, working, relaxing. There's always vibrancy and activity, both on the water and on the land. That brings places to life, adds value to the residential areas or office areas, and also adds value to the people who actually just want to relax there. So those sort of things are very important too. If there are historic buildings in historic shape, we're doing some work with CADU, the Welsh Heritage Agency, to look at distinctiveness in an area and how areas grew up. So why are the roads in a particular area? What are the forms and character of the buildings that were there? And then reflecting that in any new development. Because generally when places have built up, people have entered a town or a city from a particular direction. And quite often you see new developments and new car parking that mean people then come in from the side. So when you come into a high street, it no longer makes sense. You're coming in from a different angle, whereas it's been designed for you to travel through a town in a particular way, and the buildings make sense visually in that way as well. So again, it's making sure that the areas make sense to you visually, in your senses. It just feels right as you go into a place. And then if it feels right and you're happier, you're probably going to spend longer there, perhaps spend more in the shops and the businesses, and again, that creates opportunities for the people who live there as well. So it's getting all those things together. So part of my job is actually helping people to see waterways in a different way, and see how they can be used as part of the landscape, how they can be used to generate economic growth, create jobs, support jobs if they're there already, change people's perceptions of an area, which can be extremely powerful. It's amazing how just restoring, improving, or putting water into a place changes people's perception, brings new investment in. People will invest in an area where their employees want to live and work. So again, that helps them as well. So it's selling waterways to other people, helping them see how they can use waterways to deliver their own objectives. And that although a lot of waterway infrastructure can be seen as being expensive, if you look at the public benefits that waterways deliver, it's actually a really good return. It's very cheap. But they deliver a little of a lot. So you have health and well-being benefits, particularly in terms of mental health and chronic disease. You've got sustainable transport, which these days generally in the UK is walking and cycling. You've got quality of life, just people just feel better because the waterway is actually there, and then of course you've got the economic benefits on top of that, as well as conserving part of people's culture and history. So there's all manner of things that are delivered by waterways, and I'm sure I've left a few off there,
But that was brilliant. But there was a particular comment you made about blurring the edges, which I think, from the point of view of contemporary spatial planning and the kind of planning that the partners might be involved with, that was a very practical proposition, or something that one can visualise. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's two other areas where you're actually looking at land and water, and one is to blur the edges between the land and the water, so that you haven't got a fixed edge, but both visually your eye is drawn out to the water or vice versa, so drawn into the land, so that you haven't got a fixed edge between the two. It's using that activity on the waterway to help you actually see that you're part of a bigger area rather than being constrained on a harbour side. But the blurring can also be in terms of uses. So looking at public space and looking at the ground and the water in the same way as public space, so it's both accessible for different uses, and how the uses can change. So it might be a car park one day, but it could be an open air theatre the next, or it could be an art installation next, or it could be an area for public meetings. So making sure that the ground itself is flexible in its use, and you can bring uses there, or you can change the uses as time goes on.
And I guess that would shift on a daily basis, say during the day and perhaps at night.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you want to say something about that.
A little cafe bistro I went in many years ago, which is now part of the Ludlow Food Centre. But if you went first thing in the morning, there were 4 mica tables, and it was a transport cafe. You went at lunchtime, and it was a little bistro with 4 mica tables with cloths on and slightly different lighting. Went back in the evening, and it was a restaurant. And it's thinking about the same way, how you can use the same bit of infrastructure in as many ways as possible. The Stockton Riverside Festival has been a very good example of that. I think it still is, but Stockton has improved to the extent that it's not quite as surreal as it was the first time I went there. But there they used the ground in an extremely different way for art installations, which were primarily street theatre and street artists working. So that a roundabout had a freight container on it, which had 2 cinemas in it. Just on an ordinary traffic island, there was 2 cinemas on there. They had a theatre that was made entirely out of scaffolding and temporary seating that was on a major car park, which had pumps using water from the river then to create some of the activity during the telling of the story of the building and the sinking of the Titanic, which was fantastic. Once you were there, you had no idea you were in a car park. And you can use common ground in all sorts of different ways, and it's understanding how you can actually do that and making sure you build that flexibility in.
And I guess also there's a seasonal element in this, isn't there, that will change depending on what latitude the different partners are at in relation to what's possible and what the opportunities are.
I think that there's a seasonal issue in terms of using the summer season and the conventional tourist season to support facilities that then last throughout the year. So to give you another example of that, there's a little building on the Montgomery Canal where other transfer did go to the Montgomery, and it's a small cafe and it's a small shop. It serves a community of about 400 people, so it's quite a small community, not a community that you would expect to support a shop. It's also got 2 bed and breakfast, so it's accommodation. Mm-hmm. They can put computers in there, so it can be an internet cafe, and also they can show films in the same place. So it's a really flexible space. They've now got bike hire and canoe hire, and there's a little model railway that runs there as well. So it's a very flexible space, serving people, but it's supported by the traffic on the canal, the fact that tourism is there during the summer, that then keeps it there all year round. The other way is using activity, festivals, events as a way of extending the season and bringing people into the area outside the normal season, either extending the season or doing something completely different. Something we can't do in the UK at the moment is do what they do in Canada and elsewhere, which is actually have a completely different use of the water in the winter. So just recently the Rideau Canal has now opened again as a skating route in Canada, and you see it elsewhere as well, where canals are used to skate, or we see it in town piazzas now, where you've actually got an ice rink in the winter. We don't have the sustained winters to allow us to do it on the canals, but that's one example. But there are all sorts of other ways of actually using the water, or perhaps activities like hedge laying in the autumn and things like that as well, that could bring traditional crafts to life, but also create activity and bring people to a waterway out of season.
And that might require some extra skills or some extra learning or some research or something to